The title is Developing Criteria for Compared Military Medical Trauma Across Modalities. Just as a courtesy for our presenters, just to remind you to turn off or silence your cell phones. If you need to leave, just please exit through the door that you entered in. And a reminder that all conference registrants are eligible to obtain CEU credits for all paper presentations this year. So please ensure that you are scanned in, which our nice attendant is walking around and making sure you're all scanned in. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Shannon Bailey, and she is a senior human factors scientist at the University of South Florida Center for Advanced Medical Learning and Simulation. She also serves as an assistant professor in the USF Health Morsonnet College of Medicine's Department of Medical Education. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present Dr. Bailey.
Hi everyone, my name is Shannon Bailey, and today I will be presenting research that we conducted with US SOCOM on developing criteria to compare military medical trauma simulations across modalities. So this presentation is split into three parts, like the study that we conducted. So first I'll go into depth with the evaluation criteria that we developed. Then I'll go into the data collection process where we had combat medics as part of a technical experimentation event evaluate different simulations for combat medics. And then I'll go through the data analysis that we did and discuss the results. So combat medic training involves learning life-saving procedures, usually under difficult conditions, and this can include in active combat, in austere environments or challenging environments, and also in multi-casualty situations. Since the introduction of tactical combat casualty care training in the 1990s, there's been a significant reduction in preventable combat deaths. But there's been recent research that shows that there's a need for more training, particularly pre-deployment or between deployments. And this is to reduce the peacetime effect or the known degradation of skills that happens during periods of lower combat intensity that has historically led to worse outcomes for early casualties in a new conflict. So to meet these training needs, simulation is used. So when we talk about healthcare simulation, that includes a range of different modalities or types of simulation. On the left here, you can see pictures that show examples of different types of modalities. And then on the right is a list of common simulation modalities for healthcare training. And these are the simulation modalities that we included in this study as part of the technical experimentation event. So we have everything from low and high fidelity mannequins to task trainers, virtual and augmented reality, serious games, cadavers, role players are also called standardized patients. Moulage, which is makeup or special effects that's usually put on standardized patients or sometimes mannequins. And then also live tissue training, and those are animal models. So first, simulation is not a one-size-fits-all, so you can't interchange these modalities for all types of training outcomes. A recent NATO report that looked at different healthcare simulation modalities found that there's not a single environment that links realism, haptics, and emotional connection. They also concluded that there wasn't evidence that one modality was superior to other modalities, that we should consider a blend of modalities based on the available resources for training. They also concluded that there's a need to benchmark standards for simulation modalities, so that simulation modalities, we know when and where to use them, and then also to develop guidelines for integrating simulation modalities into our training curricula. So to meet those needs, we conducted an exploratory study where we evaluated the capabilities and limitations of simulation modalities for combat medic training. So we did this in three parts. First, we developed the evaluation criteria, and this was so we could compare the very different types of simulation modalities. So how do we compare a cadaveric model to a mannequin to augmented and virtual reality? So we developed evaluations for that. Then we conducted a study where we had combat medics evaluate different simulations that industry developers presented to them. And then finally, we compared those simulation modalities both on the quantity of the capabilities that the simulations could do, and also the quality of those simulations. So now I'm going to go into depth with how we developed the evaluation criteria, because that was the main part of the study. The evaluations were developed to quantify the degree to which simulators could provide training for a specific task. So we did this in two parts. The first part is section A, where we were looking at quantifying the capabilities. So here we developed task analyses for each of 12 medical tasks, and these were step-by-step lists of the steps for each task, as well as tallies of the different types of capabilities within each of those tasks, which I'll go into depth in the next slide. So that was comparing the quantity within the capabilities. Then we looked at the quality of those capabilities with subjective evaluation. So this was section B, where we had the evaluators rate on a bunch of different qualities of each of the simulators. So going more into depth into how we developed those cognitive task analyses, we created 12 task analyses for combat casualty care tasks, and these are the list of tasks that were included in the study, so everything from a chest tube and cricothyroidotomy down to tourniquets and wound packing. So you don't have to read this whole slide. I know it's a lot of text, but I'm going to focus on the green there on the left, that column. So for each of these 12 tasks, we did a cognitive task analysis where we listed out all of the steps to perform a task. And these lists came from both the soldier's manual and the TC3 assessments, and also input from subject matter experts. Then for each of those steps, we listed which ones were critical steps, so more important steps than others. We then listed for the critical steps whether or not it allowed an error. So this is important for training because you need to know whether or not a trainee knows how to perform a step. So if a simulator doesn't allow you to make an error on a typical trainee mishap that might happen, then you don't know whether or not that trainee knows how to complete that step. For example, if you're doing a needle chest decompression and you need to place a needle in the correct location, if the simulator doesn't allow you to place the needle in the wrong location, you're not allowing a trainee to make a typical error. So for critical steps, we also had whether or not it allowed for typical errors. Then for the critical steps, we also looked at sensory features that might be necessary information to perform that step. So these could be visual, haptic, or auditory information that you need to know in order to complete that step. So for example, a cricothyroidotomy, you need to know where to make the incision. Feeling the landmarks is an important sensory cue that you need in order to know where to make the correct incision. So that would be haptic information that would be important for a simulation to include. And then finally, we also looked at different types of sensory feedback that might be important for you to know that you've completed that step to move on to the next step. So if a simulator doesn't provide this information, you might not know whether or not you've completed that step correctly in order to move on to the next step, or look in which step you should go to next. So for example, if you are trying to control a hemorrhage by placing a tourniquet, and you need to know that you have tightened it enough that the bleeding has stopped, seeing that bleeding stop would be an important visual cue that you need to know that you perform that step correctly or do something else. So those were the section A, were the task analyses by each of those 12 tasks. Next, I'll discuss the subjective evaluations, so section B. We had evaluators rate their subjective views on different attributes. So we had 4 different subscales. First, we had the general acceptability of a simulation for each task with several questions under that. We also had the realism of different features of the simulation. We had the reusability or deployability of a simulation, and then finally the simulation's ability to measure performance. And these were based on the best practices literature in this field, mastery learning principles that found that measuring performance was important. And unlike the task analyses in section A, the section B questions were identical across all of the tasks. So there's only one section B. And evaluators rated their agreement on these items on a scale from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. So then we collected the data as part of an existing technical experimentation event, a 5-day TE event, where developers were given a list of 12 combat casualty care tasks to choose to present to the evaluators, these combat medics. And those were the tasks on the earlier slide. Then we had 33 combat medics evaluate the 27 simulations that were brought by industry developers. For each of these simulations, we asked the medics to evaluate the capability of the simulation using those both the task analysis from Section A and the subjective evaluation in Section B. And then we also made sure to ask the combat medics to evaluate only the current capabilities of a simulation and not to include a potential future capability, so only what was presented there today. We had, for our evaluators, 33 experienced combat medics. They were active duty, retired, or reservists from the US military. All of them had medical experience with an average of almost 12 years of medical experience. A majority had experience treating live casualties in a combat environment, and a majority were also medical instructors with over 4 years of instructing experience. They were average of 34 years old, and all were male. So next, moving on to how we collected the data. As part of this TE event, we divided the combat medics into 4 smaller groups. That way they had more hands-on time with the simulations. The developers had equivalent time, so 45 minutes, with the combat medics to present their simulation or simulations. After those 45 minutes, there was a reset period where the combat medics switched rooms to go to a different developer, and the developers had 15 minutes to reset their simulation. This repeated until every group of combat medics saw every simulation. So now I'll talk about how we analyzed the data. We made an a priori decision prior to doing the data analyses that we would not include any simulations that received fewer than 7 responses in the statistics because we didn't want to bias the statistics. So this means that moulage and role player simulations didn't reach that cutoff, that threshold, so they weren't included in these analyses. For the analyses, I'll present the overall results for Section A and the overall results for Section B. These are collapsed across all of the tasks, so all of the different simulations and all of the different tasks. And if you are interested in a breakdown by the analysis, by the task and by the modality, we also have those data available. But here I'll only be providing the overview. So these are the results overall for Section A, where we collapsed across all of the tasks for the task analyses, looking at how much of a simulation, how much of a task a simulator could do. So you can see on the left axis there, 0 would be 0% of the simulation could be done by that simulator, and 100% would be 100% of the steps could be done by a simulator. And then along the bottom axis, we have the different types of steps. So A there would be whether, those are the critical steps. B are whether or not it allowed for critical errors. C, D, and E were the sensory features, whether those were included in the simulation. F is the non-critical steps, and G are the total steps. So if you don't want to look at this whole graph, just look at either the critical steps all the way on the left or the total steps all the way on the right. What you can see in this graph are that some modalities did have more variance than others, and this means that the evaluators had differing opinions on those modalities. So you can see that virtual and augmented reality, those are the 2 bars that are lowest there. They had much wider error bars, so the opinions differed much more. Then at the top there is LTT, and that had much smaller error bars, which means that the opinions were more consistent for those responses. You can also see that LTT here had a ceiling effect, where for the majority of the tasks, they had most of the capabilities, but these were closely followed by high-fidelity mannequins and cadavers. And then next were low-fidelity mannequins combined with high-fidelity task trainers in the middle of the scale there, that blue line. And then augmented and virtual reality, those were typically lower on the capabilities. Although LTT did have the overall highest percentage of steps across all of the tasks, other modalities had greater than 90% of critical steps for most tasks. So moving on to the Section B and subjective evaluations, you can see this graph here on the left axis are the ratings. So 1 is a lower rating, and then 5 is the higher rating. And then the different subscales are on the bottom axis there. So general acceptability is first, followed by realism, then deployability, and then measurement. So you can see the same pattern of results as Section A in these Section B ratings, the subjective evaluations, where LTT was at the top, cadaveric models, high-fidelity mannequins, and then low-fidelity mannequins were next, and then augmented and virtual reality were typically towards the middle or lower end of the scale. But it was important to note that for some of the attributes, the relationships were inversely related. The ratings were inversely related. And what that means is, for example, a higher rating for realism was also linked to usually negatively correlated with reusability, deployability, or availability. So you can see with, cadaveric models are the yellow dotted line, that's the second line there. They're rated higher for realism, but lower for deployability, which makes sense. So this indicates that the context for training is important because a simulator fidelity is often a trade-off with durability and practicality. So to summarize these graphs, we conducted this experiment as part of a week-long TE event with the 33 medics, and they evaluated these simulations brought by industry developers. In section A, which are the overall quantity of the capabilities of these simulations, we did find significant differences in the amount of capabilities that different modalities could do for most tasks. At least one, and sometimes several of the simulations had greater than 90% of the critical steps available in the simulation for most of the tasks. LTT overall had the highest percentage of steps for most tasks, but other modalities were close for many of the tasks at over 90%. More of the capabilities, so next were the high fidelity mannequins and cadavers. And then low fidelity mannequins with high fidelity task trainers were in the middle of the scale. AR and VR typically had fewer overall capabilities as measured at that event. So in section B, which were the subjective evaluations, we did also find differences on the 4 subscales, but we also noted that there was a trade-off between the durability and practicality components. So the limitations of this study are important to note because this was an exploratory study that we conducted as part of an existing TE event. So we were limited in the experimental control that we had over what the developers chose to present to the combat medics for evaluation. We also provided consistent time with each developer, so they had 45 minutes with every developer. For some developers, that was a lot of time, and it was not enough time. So in the future, we might adjust the time limits there. Also, the evaluations were quite detailed, as you can tell from the beginning of the presentation. So evaluators did experience evaluator fatigue. We also had a modest sample size of 33 combat medics, and we would like to expand this in the future. So in future research, then we would potentially restrict the number of developers, simulations, and/or medical tasks that are part of the evaluation. This would help to reduce the evaluator fatigue that was felt. We could also potentially use a different experimental design, such as fractional factorial, so not every single combat medic has to evaluate every single simulation. We also would like to refine the evaluations and methodology moving forward based on the evaluator feedback. And then finally, it's really important that we investigate the relationship between simulation capabilities and then actual trainee performance. So here, this was foundational research looking at how do we quantify and compare simulation modalities, so how much of a percentage of a task can be done by a simulator, and then what was the quality of that simulation. But then we need to link the quantity and the quality of a simulation to actual trainee performance. So that would be the important next step. So in conclusion, we developed evaluations to quantify capabilities and provide consistent measurement of subjective ratings across different medical simulation modalities. Evaluators did perceive meaningful differences in the quality of the different simulations. No modality was considered uniformly superior. The modalities did have trade-offs. And also the context for training was important, with the intended learning outcomes being key to determining the appropriate simulation modality and methodology for training. We would like to thank USSOCOM for sponsoring this work, and I'm available for questions. And just a caveat, I'm not a combat medic nor a medical doctor, so if you have any clinical questions, let me know and I can direct those to my colleagues. Yes. Yes. So I'll answer the back part first. Not every modality looked at all 12 tasks. It depended on what the industry developers who were presenting, what they brought. LTT, so we did have cadaveric models as part of the TE event. The TE event also included LTT, which were animal models. Sure. Sure, yeah. So again, what happened with the TE event was the TE organizers gave a list of 12 tasks, and that was just trying to limit the number of tasks because obviously there are many different medical simulations that could be done. So they gave developers this list of 12 tasks, asked them to present something from this list, but they were also allowed to present really whatever they wanted to present to the combat medics because it was a TE event. So some of them presented things that were outside of those 12 tasks, but they weren't put in the evaluations because we didn't have the task analyses developed for those. Sure. Yeah, so several questions in there. First, none of the developers brought anything with machine learning or AI incorporated in their simulations. So that is something that I think would be very interesting to include in future simulations. And I think we could use the task analyses that have been developed in this to compare to previous studies what those capabilities are included. There was a lot of overlap for many of the tasks. I presented here just the overall collapsed across every task and every simulation. So within AR, there were several different developers, and so these are just overall numbers for AR. So some of them did have closer to other modalities than others. There's a report available through SOCOM that has all of the analyses broken down by not only the task, but the modality, and then also within each modality, each simulation. So there's a lot more data. Sure. Sure. So I do have these were all of the subjective evaluation ratings here. So they do get into a bunch of different aspects. This wasn't looking at necessarily how easy it was for like a simulation operations specialist to set it up or an instructor to set it up for use. But there are different parts here that would be useful for an instructor or SimOps to know whether or not this would be the appropriate simulation to employ. So particularly looking at like the deployability of different simulations. So some things like high fidelity mannequins, you don't necessarily want those out in the field getting damaged because they're more easily damaged than others. So that might not be the right modality to go for certain contexts. Sure. Agreed, yes. So it's not presented in these because we only looked at the task analyses and then these subjective evaluation questions, but we do have a paper that will be coming out in the Journal of Military Medicine soon that looked at free responses that the combat medics provided, and so they get into those benefits, limitations, and considerations of employing each of the modalities. So they get into things like different mannequins have different reset times, so how long it would take to use it. Some of them need specific expertise to utilize, and a lot of times that that expertise might rotate out, and then you need a new expert to come in. So it's not in this particular proceedings paper, but if you're interested, that paper should be coming out soon in military medicine. Yes, sir. I really want to do that analysis. So we didn't for this particular part. Full disclosure, the full analyses are a 170-page report, so there are a lot of analyses if you are interested in more details. We did not break it out by different experience level. We did try to keep all of the groups with a variety of, with a range of experience levels. So it was not just, all the young guys in there in one group and experienced people in another group. There was a range of experience levels in each of the groups. So we tried to make sure that we were looking overall, but there was a combination of groups, a combination of experience levels within groups. Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you so much.